All right, good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
How are you?
Good.
Good. For those of you who are hardy and came last week, I really appreciate you braving the cold with us. But this is going to be a little bit of a repeat because the video didn't come out very well, and nobody was here. So I thought we were.
Excuse me. There were people here.
You were here. The faithful, the true faithful came out. The true faithful showed up. So.
Well, it was so nice and warm. I don't know what
Peter came in his shorts, and he's like, this is summer in Canada. Oh my goodness. So I did change some of it. There's a little bit of new information, but I apologize to those of you who came last week. It'll be a little bit of a repeat.
There was so much information.
Well, I know. So maybe this will, yeah.
you could give the lectures that you were.
That's right. That's right. So just a reminder, there are some important class cancellations. Not next week, but the week after, February 22nd, is the annual church meeting during the Sunday school. Well, I've gotten 3 emails asking me to cancel class. And as I said last week, I say enough controversial things in class on a normal basis that I don't want to push my luck. So, and then March 15th, I'll be out of town, so I'll send out a cancellation notice for that. And then on Easter, everybody's busy on Easter, so so those weeks we won't meet. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about, before we get started, because we're going to talk through, like we did last week, some of the what we can see about the historical David. We don't have any real archaeological evidence or outside historical sources, so the only things that we can glean are from the text itself. And so it's not ideal if you think about, if you go to court, if we're in a traffic accident or something happened, you go to court. If you're a judge, what you would hope to have is multiple people who could say, oh, I saw this happen and I saw that happen, and maybe a video or something like that to help kind of give you some perspective of what actually happened. And that's called independent attestation. So if 2 or 3 independent people who didn't conspire together say, oh, I saw this. But if Dave says, I saw it, and then I say, oh, Dave said he saw it, that's not actually 2 witnesses, that's just one perspective, and I'm just repeating what Dave said. And that's what you get a lot of times in the Bible, is you get a repetition of a single source. A couple of other key things that scholars use when they're trying to sift through the text is, it's called dissimilarity. And so, as we know, many stories are written in the Bible, almost all the stories, honestly, are written from a perspective of trying to shore up beliefs in God. If you're in the New Testament, perspective that Jesus is the Messiah, that Jesus is God's son. And so, hey, good morning. So you're trying to shore up those things. So Jesus is a perfect example. Christians are trying to make the case when they write the New Testament, the Gospels, and Paul and the epistles, that Jesus is the Son of God. But Jesus gets crucified, right? All the different perspectives say, and that kind of runs counter to your story of, this is the King, the new Messiah who's going to liberate the world and the Son of God, and all the rest of the people are like, yeah, but he got crucified. It's an as Al Gore said, an inconvenient fact or an inconvenient truth. And so if there's things that kind of run counter to your claim, scholars say, well, there's usually more historical evidence. There's more evidence that might be a historical story. And so for David, we're not talking about it this week, but David and Bathsheba, that's a very bad look on David. If the biblical writers are trying to make David look like the man after God's own heart, that whole story of David and Bathsheba, they just can't get around it. It doesn't support their cause. And so that gives them a little more, scholars say, there's a little more probability that that could be an actual event or an accurate event. And then the last thing that they think about is it credible within the context that we're writing? So if you were in a class on the history of the United States and you were reading or researching that and you came across a diary and it's dated 1728 and it's the story of an explorer exploring and that explorer is a member of the United States, says I'm a captain in the United States military or the United States Army. And you're like, well, wait a minute, this is 1728. That's before there was even a United States. That doesn't fit within the context. So you would say, whatever this is saying, this was clearly written at a later date and moved back, post-dated, so it's not really an eyewitness account. So I think what all of this is, big picture is that we all God gave us a brain, and we have to use our brains when we look at these stories, and we have to be a little critical about how we interpret the texts, and we kind of need to make sure how do all these things fit together. Okay, so what I want to talk about today is we've gone through the past few weeks the biblical story of Saul, the biblical story of David. That's the story that the Bible tells us. And as historians or scholars, we want to say, how relevant is that? How realistic are those stories? And I would say if you really are interested in this, this is the book for you. Joel Baden is a professor of Hebrew Bible at Yale University, and this book was written in 2013. And he does a great job at just kind of laying out the arguments, many of which I'll go through today. But these arguments are not just Dr. Baden. I mean, they're pretty well held amongst most of mainstream scholarship. But there's two really critical, important assumptions that we have to make. One is we have to kind of agree that David was a real person, that somebody named David was actually a real person. And there are scholars who make the argument that David was just a fictionalized composite character of some of the early kings that kind of got, that the stories of early Israel got written around. So I'm not in that camp. I don't think that the things in the Bible are just whole cloth made up unless we're talking about, really stuff like Adam and Eve and, stuff like that. I think when we're into this monarchic period, and because of there is some little bit of historical archaeological evidence, I think David, it's a reasonable assumption to say David's a real person. And then the other thing is we have to assume that in the biblical text are at least kernels of truth, right? And we talked about this from like Moses. There's no archaeological evidence of a big exodus from Egypt, but there's enough little bits of it that buried in it. If there was not an exodus, there was likely not an exodus that looked like the biblical story of the Exodus, but there was likely some Exodus stories on a much smaller scale that may have served as the genesis for the larger tale that gets told. So those are important assumptions that we have to make, and not all scholars make those. Some of them say, nah, that's really not a basis. So as we may know, David is described as a man after God's own heart. The authors of this story, who were primarily Judean, they came from the southern kingdom of Judah, which is where David is from. They were the surviving kingdom in the Babylonian exile. They're the ones who write the story. So they are the ones who are telling the story. And in their opinion, David is fantastic. David is the epitome of what a king should be in Israel. But they've got some problems. There's some challenges with David's life. And so what they're doing is they're writing what's called an apology, or they're basically saying, hey, things are not necessarily the way it looks. It's not as bad as it looks. Let me tell you the alternative facts of how David actually became king. And I think if we go through with the critical eye, yes.
I'm sorry, I've missed what the DH stands for.
Oh, I'm sorry, the Deuteronomistic historian. So that the scholars have long said that all of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings all were written by or compiled, edited by a school of thought in ancient Israel called the Deuteronomistic school. And so they look at the book of Deuteronomy, and in the book of Deuteronomy, the theology is pretty much, if you do good things, God blesses you. It's because God has blessed you. And if bad things happen to you, it's because God has abandoned you.
Is that in contrast to what you talked about many times ago about like the priestly interpretation?
It's another source. So there's the priestly source. There's 4 sources. There's the Yahwistic source and the Elohist source. Those are the earliest sources. There's the Deuteronomistic source. That's kind of from the King Josiah, kind of that late monarchy up through the Babylonian exile. And then there's the priestly source that comes in kind of late exile and post-exile. Does that help a little bit? It's a lot to pull in there. Okay, so I think we can do with a little bit of analysis. Hey, good morning.
Good morning.
Tim, how are you? Good to see you. So I think what we can see, though, is the picture as we kind of go through this analysis. The picture of David maybe changes a little bit, and he's not so much the hero that Michelangelo painted, but more kind of a mafia gangster-ish type person. And like most people, you're a combination of a variety of things, right? There's a variety of, we all have our good points and our bad points. So the biblical story kind of lays out that we covered a few weeks ago, the story of David. But in all likelihood, David was kind of a warlord. Most of the story of David's life takes place here in the highlands, central highlands of Judah. And Judah's kind of bit, as you can see from the map here, a bit of a barrier between the Philistines who settled along the coast, northern Israel, the northern kingdom of Israel, and then Judah is down here. So he kind of roams around in Judah. He works for the Philistines. He seems to be a bit of a mercenary or a warlord. So let's talk through a few of the key elements. Best known story for David and Goliath, for David, is his defeat of the giant Goliath, which I did some research this week, or was doing some reading. And it's interesting. Well, I'll get to that in a minute. So David, this was kind of the seminal event that kind of thrust David into the limelight in Israel and put him on the center stage. And as we read in 1 Samuel 4, the champion of the Philistines stepped forward, and his name was Goliath of Gath, and he was 6 cubits and a span tall, which is about 9.5 feet tall, according to this text. He had a bronze helmet, he wore a breastplate of armor, and the shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam. And so David, of course, famously kills Goliath. He becomes integrated into Saul's court. That becomes kind of the keystone event that really puts him on the map in ancient Israel.
What is so special about a weaver's bar?
So the weaver's beam or weaver's bar is when you have a big loom and you're making, weaving cloth. It's the big bar that helps settle everything down and pull. And so it's heavy. And so they're just using it as a description as to how big and how heavy his spear was. But if we keep reading in the Bible and we get to 2 Samuel, we get another story. This is in a section of the text that talks about some of the heroic events of David's men. And you get to a battle where they're kind of going through a bunch of their battles. And we read, there was another battle with the Philistines, and Elhanan, the son of Jorar the Bethlehemite, killed Goliath the Gittite, the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. And it's like, wow, that's the exact same description that we had for Goliath, or in the David and Goliath story. So we've got a little bit of a conflict. Who killed Goliath? There have been a lot of theories kind of posted about this, that maybe because of the exploits of David, that any big Philistine soldier kind of became a general term as Goliath. We still have that today. You know, large people are called Goliaths, and they kind of just use that name throughout. But most scholars say that what likely happened is that this text that's kind of in 2 Samuel may have been the original text, and that the Goliath story got appropriated by David and David's people to take credit for that, and to kind of build up his reputation, and to tell a pretty a dramatic and a theologically significant story, because the story of David and Goliath is David coming in, standing up for the God of Israel, and defeating the enemies of God.
This is his PR department, is it?
It's PR department. And I think it's really interesting. There's a lot of textual instability around this story. So if you look at we'll start it here and work backwards. The Masoretic text, which is kind of the base text that all of scholarship uses for the Old Testament or for the Hebrew Bible. It's called the Leningrad Codex, and it dates to around 1000 BCE. And in here is pretty much the story as we read it in our current translations. But if you work your way back to the Septuagint, which is the Greek copy of the Greek translation that was done around the time of Jesus, the earliest copy we have of that is about 300 BC or 300 CE. The story is a lot different. The story's still there, but it's not as robust. Pieces are missing. The Dead Sea Scrolls, which date back to the time of Jesus, also significantly different story. So you can see that the story was getting added to over time and developed as time went on. But I think what comes out of that story is it sets the credentials of David as a warlord. David, his big claim to fame was that he could defeat the enemies of Israel or Israelite troops. He seemed to be a kind of raiding both Israelite villages, Philistine villages. There's stories in towards the end of 1 Samuel where David's working for Achish, who's the Philistine, one of the Philistine kings. He spent most scholars would say he spent a good bit of time working for Saul. So he is kind of a warrior figure who came in and got some opportunities. You can see this in some of the stories that we talked about, the stories where David and his men, when David was working for the Philistines, he would go and raid the Jezreelites, the Giznites, and the Amalekites. And when David attacked a region, he would leave no man or woman alive. He would take flocks, herds, asses, camels, and clothing. So kind of like the prescription and the harem that we read about or talked about a few weeks ago in Judges, Joshua and Judges, it's the same kind of mindset. He's going to kill everybody and take the spoils for himself. And then when he would come back, he would tell Achish, I went and raided all the Israelite settlements, but later the text would say what he really did is he went to some of the other foreign settlements. But we get another little counterpart to that text a few chapters later, and this is towards the end where Saul has died. David's kind of setting up and trying to get control of the kingdom, and he sends gifts to the elders of Judah. So in 1 Samuel 30, when David reached Ziklag, he sent some of the spoil to the elders of Judah. He sent the spoil to the elders in Bethel, Siphmoth, a whole list of things, to the Kenites, to those in Hebron. These are all cities and villages and towns in Judah, Israelite cities and towns. And these were all the places where David and his men had roamed. So as David's kind of starts out as a warlord, attacking these villages, taking their stuff, pillaging, as he's starting to consolidate power, he needs to make amends, or at least bring people into his camp. So he sends back some of the stuff that he's taken. Why would he need to do that if he had never actually attacked them, if he had always kind of been one of their defenders? So it seems like that's a pretty well attested part of David's character. Cora.
At this point, David has decided that he is going to go with the Hebrews as opposed to the Philistines.
I think David is an Israelite. He's an Israelite.
He is an Israelite.
So, this from what we get from the Bible, he's from Bethlehem, from Judea. I think he's an Israelite.
Okay.
I would say there's a limit to what he could do with the Philistines. He's not one of them. So he could be one of their trusted soldiers, but there's a limit as to how high he could go within that political structure. So he's also has connections to Saul and to the Israelite, the fledgling Israelite monarchy. So I think he sees that as a better path to power.
Okay.
Again, we talked about the story of David where he comes up to Nabal, he sends his men to Nabal, and he says, hey, for the past month or so, you've been able to feed your flocks and nothing bad has happened to you. Why don't you share some food and some money with us, and we'll make sure that things don't continue to happen. Kind of the traditional protection racket that gangsters use down to today. And Nabal says, absolutely not. I'm not going to pay you. I don't even know who David is. I've never heard of David. I'm not going to pay. And when David hears this, he and his men strap on their swords and head out to deal with Nabal. The text says, hey, Yahweh decided to take Nabal. So by the time David shows up, Nabal is conveniently dead, taken by the hands of God. There's probably David may have just shown up and said, and he might have taken care of Nabal. We don't know for sure, but clearly he continues to enrich himself. And I think the whole story of the fact that he's shaking down people and the wealthy people in Judah fits in with this overall character trait. So at some point, David becomes connected with Saul, maybe through the battles, maybe he killed, while there may be some doubt as to whether he actually killed Goliath, he was certainly a great warrior and killed plenty of Philistines. And pretty soon you can see in the text where David is being greeted as he comes back from battle, and the women of Israel are cheering and dancing, and they're saying, Saul has killed his thousands, but David his tens of thousands. So he gets kind of a foothold and gets connected with the court of Saul. And then he starts building connections throughout the system, or throughout the royal family. He marries Michal, who's Saul's daughter. He becomes a strong friendship. Some have suggested a romantic relationship. I don't know if I would go that far, but Definitely a strong friendship and connection with Jonathan, the heir to the throne, Saul's oldest son. And you can see this in the text. Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. David stripped himself of his robe, of the robe that he was wearing, and gave it to David, and his armor, and even his sword, and his bow, and his belt. These are all the things that make you king. Your royal robes, your royal belt, all this royal insignia. That's what would make Jonathan king, and he's willing to give it all to David. And there's multiple verses where they go through, David rose from the ground beside the stone heap when he had to separate from Jonathan for the last time, and he prostrated himself with his face to the ground. He bowed 3 times, and they kissed each other and wept with each other. David wept the most. And then when David hears that Jonathan has been killed, in his great eulogy of, or lament for Saul and Jonathan, he says, "I grieve for you, my brother Jonathan. You were most dear to me. Your love was wonderful to me, more than the love of women." There clearly seems to be a theme that there was a strong connection between Jonathan and David. And if David, as portrayed in the biblical text, was kind of innocent of all these things, it's bad he loses his close friend. But if David actually kind of usurped the throne and caused the death, or was responsible for the death of Saul and Jonathan and the rest of Saul's family, then it makes that betrayal even more crushing, if they were that close in friendship.
But David also was anointed by Samuel to be future king, and David also spared Saul's life when he could have taken his life. So
yeah, so there is the anointing story at the very beginning, which strangely is never mentioned again through the rest of the text. So as David continues this rise to power, there's no long debate where he's like, wait a minute, Samuel anointed me king, or Samuel coming up and saying, hey, this is now the new king. So from a historical standpoint, did that take place? Did that not take place? Most scholars would say it was put there to kind of get a key in for the readers to say, hey, you're not, you know that David is the rightful king because he was anointed by Samuel. But the characters in the story don't seem to know that.
David
So
also spared Saul's life when he could have killed him.
Right.
Biblically.
So we're going to talk about that actually just coming up. So Saul kind of comes through and says, Saul's portrayed as kind of the mad king, troubled by evil spirits, sent from God, out of God's good graces. But even in the text, Saul is the one who consistently sees the threat that David's posing to the kingdom. Saul was much distressed and vexed about the matter. This is about the people saying that David killed the tens of thousands. And he said, to David they have given tens of thousands, and to me they have only given thousands. All that he lacks is the crown, which is kind of a true statement. He had support of Saul's family. He had the support of the people. He just didn't have the crown. But while David might have been an outside threat to Saul, there seems to be no real reason other than jealousy as to why Saul would be so vehemently trying to hunt him down. Because there's a whole section in the David story where Saul is trying to kill David. He's chasing them all through Judea, trying to get rid of him, and he can't seem to do it. And the question is why? So the question is, why is he doing this? Is it simply jealousy? And this is speculated. And again, a lot of this is think through yourself and decide how much you put on it. But some scholars have speculated that what may have been the trigger for Saul to hunt down David was an attempted coup by David. So if we read in 1 Samuel, there's a listing before David comes on the scene of the family of Saul. And it says, now the sons of Saul were Jonathan, Ishvi, and Malchizedek. I'm sorry, my my Hebrew pronunciation is not that good. Anyway, and his two daughters were Merab and Michal, and the name of Saul's wife was Ahinoam. I stumble on this. Ahinoam. We'll go with that. About 10 chapters later, we read David has married Michal. He's married Abigail, the wife of Nabal, who he took all of Nabal's property. And David also married Ahinoam, and they became his wives. Is this the same Ahinoam? They're described slightly differently in the two parts of the text, but it would certainly explain why, because in the ancient world, if you slept with the concubines or the wives of the king, then you were the king. It was like the biggest threat to the monarchy. This is exactly what happens to David later on when his son Absalom takes over or tries to take over the kingdom and usurp David. Is Absalom goes in and sleeps with David's concubines, and that kicks off a big internal civil war within the court. And it's also the thing that Saul's son, we'll see in a minute, Saul's son accuses the general Abner of doing to him. So this is a common theme that kind of keeps popping up. The only other evidence or other reference to this is Saul said to his son Jonathan, this is in 1 Samuel 20, why has the son of Jesse not come to the feast, either yesterday or today? And Jonathan answered to Saul, David earnestly asked to leave of me for me to go with him to Bethlehem. And then Saul's anger was kindled against Jonathan, and he said to him, you son of a rebellious woman, do I not know that you have chosen the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of your mother's nakedness? For as long as the son of Jesse lives upon the earth, neither you nor your kingdom shall be established. So scholars have kind of stitched together and said, possibly, David tried to implement a coup over Saul to take over the power. He thought he had the support, but it was unsuccessful. What you see in the discussions of Saul and of the various wives is there's a few more genealogies in 1 and 2 Samuel. Ahinoam is never listed again as Saul's wife, but she's always listed as David's wife. So there's kind of this transition period. Is it two different women named the same name? Possibly. It's not a very common name. These are the only times this name is mentioned in the Bible. It's an interesting theory. So it seems to be hinted at that David tried to implement a coup, but it starts to explain if that's true, a bunch of the other things. It explains why Saul was pursuing David throughout the kingdom. But perhaps this was kind of an ongoing civil war, and perhaps David was also hunting Saul. And so to the point that Tim made, there was a story that in the Bible where Saul goes, he's out in the desert hunting down, trying to find David to kill him. He's with his soldiers. He gets into the cave to relieve himself. And it happens to be the same cave that David is hiding in. David goes and instead of killing him, as his men say, now you can go kill Saul, he's been delivered to you, take the opportunity. David says no. He cuts off a corner of Saul's robe as Saul is using the facilities, and then stands up on the mountain and shouts out to Saul, hey, I could have killed you when you were in the cave, but I didn't do it. Another interpretation of that story, if we kind of look at it that what the biblical writers are doing are trying to prop up the credentials of David, is that it was a story of another failed assassination attempt. Maybe David didn't really mean to spare Saul's life. Maybe he tried to kill him and Saul got away. And that became a story that the Israelites told, and the Deuteronomistic historian had to kind of overcome that and put a different spin on the story. I think the key is there's a lot of these stories that we can't necessarily just look at it the way it's presented in the Bible. We have to kind of think about what are some of the other opportunities. And as I mentioned earlier, the contextual credibility, what fits best into the overall context of the story. Okay, so whether David had an earlier coup or not, you end up in a place where there is the final coup, where David actually becomes the king. And so the Israelites go to fight the Philistines muster their forces for war, and Achish, the king of the Philistines, calls David up and says, hey, you know, of course, that you and your men must march with my forces. And David says, absolutely, surely you know what your servant will do. So at this point in the story, even in the text of the Bible, David is clearly in league with the Philistines. And the Deuteronomistic historian goes to great lengths, however, though, to make sure that David is cleared. So, according to the story, the Philistines come back and they say to Achish, you can't let a bunch of Hebrews come with us to fight with us against the Israelites. They're going to turn on us at a key time and kill us. And Achish vouches for David's trustworthiness. He says, he's been with me for years. He's an honest guy. But finally, Achish says, hey man, I'm sorry, but the rest of the team won't let you play. So you got to go. You got to leave. And so they make clear that David leaves and is nowhere near the battle. So what happens when Saul dies? We have in this big battle, we have two versions. The version at the end of 1 Samuel, where the Philistines are crowding around, and so Saul takes his own life. He doesn't want to become captured by the Philistines, so he just falls on his sword and takes his own life. But at the beginning of 2 Samuel, we get a different perspective, a second alternative, and there's a young guy, an Amalekite, who happens to be, he comes to David, and he's bearing the crown and the armlet and all the trappings of the king. And he says, I happened to be at Mount Gilboa, and I saw Saul in the chariots, and the horsemen were closing in on him. And he saw me and called to me, and he said, stand over me and finish me off, for I'm in agony and I'm barely alive. So I stood over him and I finished him off, for I knew that he would never rise from where he was lying. And then I took the crown from his head and the armlet from his arm, and I brought them here to you, my Lord David. Why would this Amalekite bring the crown and the armlet to David when Saul still has sons who are alive? Now, Jonathan was killed in the battle, and some others of Saul's sons were killed in the battle. But what we'll see is there's still a couple of other sons who would be heirs to the throne. David's not in the line of succession. What some scholars have argued is that David may have arranged for this Amalekite to be around. And if the Philistines didn't finish him off, it was this guy's job to do it. And whenever he fell, whether Saul fell at the hands of the Philistines or someone else, bring the crown to me. Because if David's trying to take over the kingdom, he needs the trappings and the symbols of the kingdom.
Is an Amalekite a Philistine or
They're a third party. So there's a different territory that's kind of abuts Israel, and that's where the Amalekites come from. There's Amalekites, there's Edomites, kind of on that eastern side of the Jordan River. So, and then when the guy comes and gives David the crown, David's response in the Bible is, how dare you lift your hand and kill the Lord's anointed? Your blood be on your own head. and David had his men strike him down, and he died. And my conclusion is, dead men tell no tales. So if he's dead, we'll never get the straight story as to whether he was there in person or whether or on David's orders, or he just happened, as his story was, happened to be wandering by. And so David went up from there, and along with his wives, and they settled down in the town of Hebron. And the men of Judah came, and there they anointed David king over the house of Judah. So Saul now is dead. The king of the first king of the united monarchy is dead. David has all of the trappings of the king. He's got Saul's crown. He's got his armlet, and the tribal elders of Judah come, and they anoint David king over the house of Judah. And David doesn't say, "Oh, you don't need to do that because I was already anointed by Samuel." Again, I think that story of David's anointing by Samuel seems to be a little bit of it kind of sits there all by itself. And it never seems to factor into the story that gets discussed later on. But this kicks off a civil war because for the rest of Israel, Saul's army commander, Abner, he goes to Saul's remaining son, Eshbaal, and he anoints him king over all of Israel. So now you've got David, who's the king of Judah, and Ishbaal, who is the king of Israel, because he's the surviving son of Saul. And then this kicks off a multi-year civil war, a war between the house of Saul and the house of David. And Abner supported the house of Saul. Abner was Saul's military commander. But after a period of time, we find out a few chapters later, Saul had a concubine named Rizpah, and Eshbaal, Saul's son, said to Abner, "Why have you lain with my father's concubine?" Eshbaal is basically accusing Abner of fomenting an insurrection against him, trying to take over and grab the crown and the power for himself. And Abner became very upset by what Eshbaal said, and he replied, "Am I a dog from Judah?" Kind of a slur against David. "Here I have been loyally serving the house of your father Saul, and I have not betrayed you into the hands of David, and yet this day you reproach me over a woman." So Abner is infuriated, and while he may not have to that point betrayed him into the hands of David, that's exactly what he does in the following verses. He gets insulted, he goes to the elders of Israel, and they conspire to be able to turn over the throne and make David king. So Abner went, and in the biblical text, the elders say, "Yeah, that sounds like a good idea to me." So Abner went and informed David in Hebron of the wishes of Israel and the whole house of Benjamin. And when Abner came to meet David in Hebron, David made a feast for Abner, and Abner said to David, "Now I will go and rally all of Israel to your majesty. They will make a pact with you, and you can reign over all that your heart desires." And David dismissed Abner, who, according to the biblical text, went away unharmed. So Abner comes and basically says, "Hey, I can give you the entire northern kingdom if you want. I've talked to the elders, we're all good." Elsa.
I've got a question. Is this name, where's the name that has Baal at the end?
Yes, it was right there, Eshbaal.
Do you think that has anything to do with God?
So there's been a lot of scholarly debate as you see the name Baal in a lot of Hebrew names or names of Hebrew characters. And it could mean either one of two things. Either the writers of the Bible are kind of trying to use that. Usually when there's a Baal in the name, they're one of the bad people. They're one of the people you don't want to be the hero of the story. So it could be the writer saying, we're going to call them Baal because that is the name of the Canaanite god who is not Yahweh, and we need to push back against them. Or it's a reflection that even though they were a Yahwistic religion and they were kind of trying to have follow Yahweh, that they were still hanging on to their original religion and still worshiping Baal and sometimes naming their kids. So either way, it's kind of not a good look. They're not doing what in the Deuteronomy, the Deuteronomist is saying you should do. But yeah, it's an interesting choice of a name for the king of Israel.
The other thing I wanted to say, how did they keep track of it? This is a mess. How did they
Pol-
keep, and they didn't even have email or text.
Politically,
Communicate with each
and that's why if you had all the trappings of power, that tended to mean you were the king.
But still, I mean, the communication is
Yes.
poor because the distance and the way they had to, the means that they have to get to one another. I mean,
Yes. It would take days, weeks.
Yes, and they would
Months.
probably had a new king by then.
That's right. That's
They
right.
needed email or Google, right?
Oh, Lord.
So David sends Abner away unharmed, but then Joab, who is David's general, shows up, and he says, and he gets told that Abner had come to see David, and he was and had been dismissed by him. And Joab went to David and said, "What have you done? Are you crazy? Here Abner came to you. Why did you let him go? You could have just killed him, and everything would be over. Don't you know that Abner came only to deceive you, to find out all that you were planning?" So Joab left David and sent messengers after Abner, and the messengers brought Abner back to Hebron, but David knew nothing about it, according to the biblical text. And when Abner returned to Hebron, Joab took him aside within the gate to talk to him privately, and there he struck him in the belly and killed him. So now Abner is dead. And again, did David really know nothing about it, or is this just another part of the plot and part of the effort to keep David's hands clean of a coup
Well, if he
to
didn't
overthrow the
think
kingdom?
about it, he didn't have much control over his kingdom.
Right.
If all these things could happen without his knowledge.
Yep. And then when Ishbaal heard that Abner had died in Hebron, he lost heart, and all of Israel was alarmed, no doubt, because now the general, the leader of your troops is dead. And then we find out that Saul had 2 company commanders who had served Saul, and these guys took it upon themselves to go to the home of Ishbaal in the middle of the day while the king was taking a well-deserved nap. And he was sleeping on his bed, and they entered into the house while he was asleep, and they stabbed him to death. They cut off his head, and they brought it to David in Hebron. And they said, "Here is the head of your enemy, Ishbaal, son of Saul, who sought your life." And David, of course, says, "What are you doing, killing the anointed one of God? He's the king. As the Lord lives, the man told me in Ziklag that Saul was dead, thought he was bringing me good news. I will certainly avenge his blood on you, and I will rid the earth of you." And David gave orders to his soldiers, who killed the two commanders, and they cut off their hands and their feet, and they hung them up by a pole in Hebron. There's a lot of, this is Games of Thrones level violence. And then at that point, all the tribes, and so this is kind of the conclusion to the long civil war following the death of Saul. All the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, "Hey, we're of your own flesh and blood. Long before now Saul was the king over us, but it was you who led Israel into war, and the Lord has said to you, you shall shepherd my people Israel. You shall be ruler of Israel." And David made a pact with them in Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over all of Israel. So at this point in the story, and then just to clean up any last remaining loose ends, David says, "Is there anyone left of the house of Saul?" And they answered the king, "Yes, there's still a son of Jonathan, but his feet are crippled. He's not going to be a warrior." And so David had him brought from the house of Machir. And when Mephibosheth came to David, he flung himself on his face and he prostrated himself, I'm sure, he thought, I'm about to be killed. And David said, Mephibosheth, don't be afraid, for I will keep faith with you for the sake of your father Jonathan. Moreover, you shall always eat at my table. And after that, Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem, for he regularly ate at the table of David. So he essentially became a prisoner within the court. He wasn't a military threat to David, but David kept him close. What's the old saying? Keep your friends close and your enemies closer. So Saul now had complete control over Israel, but with a pretty big body count. Saul was dead, Jonathan was dead, Abner was dead, Eshbal was dead, and Mephibosheth was a prisoner within David's court. And all of the other foot soldiers who had helped David along the way, they were also dead, or may have helped David along the way. And again, dead men tell no tales. At that point, nobody's left to do this. And what's interesting is when you get to the end of 2 Samuel, where David's about to die and he's offering guidance to his son Solomon, who's going to become the king, and who is actually skipping the lines of the kingdom. Solomon was not the first in line to be king, but David gives him king. And his parting words are to his son Solomon is, go around and clear out all the people who are a threat to you. So like father, like son, which Solomon did. So I think what the bulk of scholars would say is that David was clearly not Israel's choice for a king. They had anointed Saul to be king. They wanted a king. They had made Saul the king over Israel. But David usurped the throne and was now in control. And if you follow Deuteronomistic theology, and remember, these stories are all being written down many centuries later, God spurns the evil and blesses the faithful. That's kind of the root of Deuteronomistic theology. So Saul had his entire kingdom stolen from him. Therefore, Saul must have done something to offend God. Otherwise, God would not have allowed Saul to lose his kingdom. And there's stories in there, a couple of different stories as to why Saul lost the kingdom. We talked about that. Saul gave the sacrifice too soon before Samuel showed up. That's one version of the story. The other story is he was supposed to go and wipe out the entire village, and he didn't do it. He kept the king alive, and he kept all the spoils for himself, and that was the reason that Yahweh. Those are the two different versions of why Saul fell out of favor with Yahweh. However, David successfully usurped the kingdom, and his family held on to the Judean dynasty, even though a united Israel was very short-lived. There was always a ruler of David who sat on the throne in Judea. In Israel, that was a whole nother hot mess of intrigue because there were constantly civil wars and political assassinations, and they would turn over in new dynasties over and over and over again. It was much more tumultuous. But the house of David sat solidly over Judea until the Babylonian exile. So clearly, David must have been blessed by God. And that what we have received to us is an edited version of the story that follows those same theological mindsets. It's not a pretty story, but honestly, it's a story that we've seen play out over the past 3,000 years. And even today, you can point to the political intrigue of your choice and see similar types of things of people taking over.
Also, to finish the story in the New Testament, in Matthew, it's very clear that this is important. Jesus, the Messiah, was from the line of David.
Jesus.
It's not an accident. If our story about Jesus is true, David was important.
David was the king of Israel and his house, and he ends up in the line of Jesus.
Biblically, he was the line of Jesus, so that's important.
And when we get in a few weeks to talk about historical Jesus, we'll see that there were a lot of messy things in the line of Jesus. When you go through that genealogy, there's some really interesting and challenging stories.
So he was
Yeah.
God's line.
Right. Cora.
Well,
Is
Jesus
the
is-
line is it a maternal line in, or is it a paternal line? I've heard both,
I have heard both as well.
and if it's a paternal line, we got a problem.
Both
It-
Mary and Joseph of Jesus worked as
and
one.
Mary.
They both were. So you can go either way.
So,
Both lineage accounts in the different gospels.
In the
talk about
gospel.
The line of Mary and the line of Joseph. So either way you want to take
Okay.
it, Jesus was from the line of David.
Okay.
yeah. We'll talk, see you, Richard. We'll talk a little bit about that when we get to the historical Jesus, because it is somewhat confusing.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. I believe that traditionally, and I'm not an expert on this, but I believe traditionally Jewish heritage is passed through the mother
That's what I
line.
thought.
But, and I will do some research and clarify that to
Okay,
make sure I'm
thank you.
good. Okay, so that's it. So I'll see you guys next week. If you're interested more, again, I highly recommend all three of these books. The Historical David goes into a deep dive over all the stuff that we kind of covered today. Extremely fascinating. And you get elements of that both in, as well, the Knight and Levine book and the Finkelstein book. So I encourage you to look in those if you haven't already. You guys have a great week. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
New content next week for my troopers.